This is Stygian Sagas, dark fiction read by the author. Tonight, Kamchatka. What do you know about Kamchatka? The hulking man across the cheap plastic table spoke in Russian so rustic that my non-native ears strained to keep pace. His look was coarse, icy, every bit as uninviting as the region's reputation. I know it's remote, I said, trying not to sound shaken. Unpredictable, grandiose, the perfect place to catch some landscape shots. The stranger had taken his place upon the comically small chair opposite mine without invitation, thumping across the barren little barroom like he owned the building. The native Koryak youths running the place, jolted from their dozes behind the orders window, didn't seem to contest this. They had disappeared behind the dividing wall and kept to themselves. I was alone. As he leaned over the space between us, yesterday's long helicopter ride north over the howling wilderness to reach this far-flung outpost seemed to replay in my head. His eyes narrowed, and I internally wondered whether this excursion was going to be cut short at the first stop. I cursed that I'd left my shotgun propped up against the doorway outside, wincing as the stranger's weight made the table buckle. "You're hunting stories." "I'm here to photograph," I told him, holding up my hands as if surrendering. "I'll do a bit of hiking, then write up a travel article or two." He laughed, nodding his head, the tension slightly easing as he let himself smash back down into his little chair. It was loud, magnified by the stained walls of the dingy concrete room, the scene made manic by the flickering post-Soviet light bulbs above. I smelled the liquor on him now. "Take care, then, photographer," he said, wagging a finger. "There's a lot more than unpredictable weather to worry about out there." With that, the stranger stood, wobbling a bit as he caught his balance. He made for the bar, taking a crate of unlabeled vodka from the nervous Koryaks. He paid for the transaction in furs pulled from a battered pack upon his shoulders, as if this were the 19th century rather than the 21st. Then, the loud Russian strode out of the establishment whistling, ducking to clear the low doorframe and leaving me to nurse my cheap morning beer in uneasy peace. When I had regained what little comfort I could find in these unfamiliar surroundings, I made to pay at the counter. One of the Koryaks came out front to meet me, scanning the room for the departed stranger as if he might slide from behind one of the battered rugs on the walls. Only after my host had ensured we were alone did he tell me to be cautious, reminding me to always keep my shotgun close at hand. There had been several disappearances over the course of the past year, he told me. Locals, mostly, Koryak hunters and trappers gone missing during routine trips into the woodland. Bears were worry enough, he said, but the natives knew well the dangers of local wildlife. His people believed the blame lay at the feet of the Old Believers, a sort of rural sect of orthodoxy, roughly analogous to the Amish in my own country. Warning me to steer clear of their dwellings in the woods, he bid me good luck, and I strode out into the gray light of the crisp summer dawn. The little hamlet in which I stood was a drab, brutalist Soviet construction, seeming to have been dropped from the sky onto the beautiful but desolate landscape. The roads leading here were so rough that unpaved would be a generous description, and with most supplies delivered by helicopter or plane, they had been left to the elements. Its isolation was surreal, exactly the kind of otherworldly travel location I had been searching for. After a night's rest in the bunker-like spare room of the bar, it was time for me to make all the trouble of getting here worthwhile. Swinging my pack and shotgun up onto my shoulders, I made for the edge of town, consulting my maps along the way. I captured images here and there of the brooding buildings behind me as I scaled the wooded hills, the settlement seeming ghostly despite the bustling inhabitants on the streets below. It was old before its time, a state-constructed community left waiting for a promised future which had never arrived. When I crested the first ridge and turned the camera upon the miles of untamed land beyond, I was reminded how far I was from civilization. Not a single logging road or signal tower marred the dense conifers blanketing the rolling hills. The distant mountains, snow-capped and backed by the gray haze of the surreal subarctic morning, were like something pulled from a painting. The view breathed new energy into me, dispelling the tension of my morning encounter in the bar and driving my eager stride into the woods. I forged on without much care, feeling more familiar now that the sounds of town were behind me. Northern Kamchatka was cool, even in the summer, its forests similar to those I'd witnessed across Russia during the past few months, and I felt I was in my element. Each additional scenic sweep that presented itself to me reassured me further, letting me know my visit to this seldom trodden part of the country had been worth the effort. Articles describing this hidden gem were writing themselves in my mind with each sunny glen and majestic woodland I passed. Morning ticked on into the afternoon, and my hike brought me up yet another ridge. The forgotten unease, abandoned in town, seemed to sweep back into me in one rancid wave. I looked now upon a treeless valley of marshy, browned grass, centered on a distant river murmuring across the swampy steppe. Each inhalation I made seemed to echo off the large boulders crowding in around me on the hillside. It took a while longer to register what had raised my hairs and quickened my heartbeat, but eventually it sank in. All had fallen silent. The birdsong I could hear was at my back within the safety of the trees, muted by the ridge I'd crested. No squirrels jostled the underbrush, and no unseen reindeer flitted through the scrub grass. The only noise that graced the unliving marsh before me was the babbling of that foggy river. Even the wind seemed to have abandoned the place, the tall grass standing hushed and motionless. The open ground was paradoxically claustrophobic, the vast expanse somehow suffocating, though I could not immediately place why. Photographing the melancholic ground as I went, I picked my way down onto the plain and forged a path north through the grasses along the valley, winding around boggy ponds and muddy runoff as I went. No birds were stirred up by my passing, and no rabbits leapt from my path. All the while, I fought back that nagging open-air claustrophobia, the very sky above seeming to leer down at me with each grinding footfall upon the soggy earth. Several hours later, having sat down on a stone to eat a modest late lunch, I spotted something cresting the ridges to the west of the valley about half a mile away, which cut my meal short. Simultaneously, their arrival made me realize why the open expanse of the valley had seemed so repressive. There was nowhere to hide. Moving in a larger group than I'd ever seen before, about a dozen brown bears had exited the woods. They were forging a path of their own down the hills at a ponderous pace, headed for the river. This put them on a collision course with me, so I decided to ford the shallow river and continue north on the other side. While I was armed and the bears were almost certainly in the market for fish rather than human beings, I had no desire to be caught too close to them out on the marsh. Quickening my pace, I covered good ground, eating on the move. Every once in a while, I looked back to find the bears poking around the riverbank far behind, eyeing me just as I eyed them. When I was about a mile from them, perched on a lonely rise in the marsh, I looked back just as an ear-splitting vocalization ripped down the valley. The bears, rearing up like spooked cattle, scattered back towards the distant ridges and the woods beyond. Puzzled, I scanned the southern horizon, my blood running cold. The sound was foreign to my ears, both similar to the aggravated roar of a bear and unmistakably different. It was as if a Kodiak had bellowed into a great funnel, its pitched-down call reverberating down the valley with a ferocity that was almost physical. Nothing should be able to scatter bears up here, I thought. Again, the call sounded, ringing out from the south, as if in answer to my dismissal. There was a second just afterwards, lower and growling, like the aftershock of an earthquake. Over the eastern ridges, beyond my view from the valley, thunder rolled, and for the first time I felt a breeze stir the marsh. From my place atop the little hill, I thought I could see movement through the tall grasses on the southern horizon, but it was impossible to tell, with the breeze shifting the growth. I damned the wind's sudden arrival, but another minute spent squinting at the distant grassland did nothing to clear my worry. Once more, the call sounded, and I couldn't help but imagine that this one seemed fuller, closer, perhaps. I resolved now was the time to make like the bears and get out of the way. I scanned the distant ridges, judging them to be more than a 10-minute run in either direction. Though I had no idea what was making that noise, I had a feeling it wouldn't be good to be seen in the open on those hillsides. Whatever was pushing north through the marsh, I would be in its full view on these rocky slopes. Turning north, I initially thought it hopeless, but finally spotted a looming roof amongst a lonely outcrop of towering pines. While this too involved a run, the way was entirely shielded by masking grass. Besides, the prospect of putting a solid wall between me and this unnerving collar on the marsh seemed inviting, especially with the afternoon deepening into a stormy evening overhead. With a glance over my shoulder to the south, I set off at a steady jog, trying to stay low in the tallest patches of grass, ears keen for more of those unnameable roars. They continued, intermittent and growing ever louder, stalking me at a distance across the windy plain and echoing off the concrete structure before me. When I came into its shadow, the building ceased to seem like the refuge I'd taken it to be from afar. A great U-shaped block I took to be a prison, the helicopter pad in its center had long been devoured by weeds, and this little outcrop of woods seemed intent on finishing the rest. Lichen had covered most of its surface, gnawing at the concrete, and almost all of its windows had been shattered, gaping like thirsty maws behind rusted metal bars. Even as yet another of the unearthly howls let loose on the marsh, I couldn't bring myself to approach the thing. It was sturdily built, to be sure, but it was off. There was an air of subdued maliciousness about the place, some unspoken threat behind those jagged windows, and I felt as if I were observing the bobbing light of an anglerfish. Whatever this place was, it would be a mortal mistake to enter it. I scanned the woodland, frantically picking out a bed of low, dense scrub about 70 yards from the building. I dove into it, making myself scarce, trying to ensure I was obscured from all angles. Though a part of me felt foolish, I couldn't shake the assumption that whatever was making those awful noises was dangerous, All I could manage in my shaken state was to subdue my ragged breathing, my wide eyes honed on the marsh and my hands blanching white as they gripped my shotgun. The trek had gone from mild to menacing so quickly that I hadn't had time to speculate on what those noises meant beyond danger, or what the building might hide beyond threats. Lying there on the cool soil, I would begin to imagine the worst, imbuing both with terrible shapes and intentions. The rumbling approach of the storm didn't help, whipping up the vegetation around me and masking the sounds from the marsh. When, at length, the noises neared some 20 minutes later, they quickly dissipated, moving beyond the building complex and then ceasing altogether. Though the caller had been close enough to make my eardrums rattle in those final few minutes, it must have remained low to the ground, for I saw only shifting grass and jostled saplings as it passed. Even these vague signs weren't clear, for the whole of the marsh was being rattled by the moaning wind. Initially, this left me relieved, prematurely celebrating my escape. However, as yet more minutes trickled past and the sky darkened overhead without another roar from the desolate marshland, my relief deflated. Why would the noises stop now? Was it nearby? Looking through the trees to the towering concrete prison-turned-tomb, I could guess the answer to that question. As the thunder neared and the winds worsened, I debated, weighing each option in turn, eyes never leaving the abandoned prison's menacing silhouette in the gathering gloom. Just as I began to think retracing my steps along the marshy valley after sneaking from the woods would be the best option, the downpour began. Lightning raked the marsh somewhere out beyond the prison, momentarily bathing it in an eerie, icy daylight. I had no interest in being a lightning rod on the flatland steppe, so I stayed low and resolved to wait out the storm. Reasoning that whatever had made the howls had traveled during the day, I planned to leave under the cover of darkness whenever the lightning had moved on. Had I only known what awaited me, I might have risked the lightning. I might at least have crawled across the grasslands, muddy and soaked, covering what little ground I could. Unnerving as my situation was, though, I didn't yet believe myself to be in mortal danger. The cracking booms of lightning strikes were more tangible than whatever I imagined had bedded down in the ruined prison. The storm had been unexpected, I told myself, so surely it would bluster past and leave me to my own devices before long. That decision stuck for just over an hour, right up until the first ancient pine off to my right fell under the onslaught of the wind, its crash deafening even under the savage din of the storm. Splintered wood and cracking branches could be heard all across the little outcrop of trees, and the lightning had yet to retreat beyond the hills. I had to move, I knew, and there was only one place I could go. With a desperation that felt cruel, I left the forest on shaking, soaked legs and made for a covered loading dock of some kind in the center of the prison complex. Shotgun at the ready and crouched low, I silently pushed up onto the long vacant raised platform and sat down on the uncomfortable concrete. My back was to the barren wall, as far from the rusted doors lining the dock as I could get, and my wide eyes scanned the barred windows on the opposite side of the courtyard. With the rain thrumming upon the steel roof overhead, my ears strained for any sound against the wild cacophony. Not a sound reached me through the storm. I never relented to sleep, even as the minutes dragged on into hours, never allowing myself to forget the howling cries I'd heard earlier on the marsh. That refusal to become complacent might just have saved me. Long after the short summer night had closed in, and the thunder had begun to stalk off to the west. I began to consider the path out once again. With the wind still howling over the open marsh, the noise of my retreat into the grass would be masked. Hopefully, the softened rain would disperse, and I would be able to put distance between myself and the prison before disappearing into the woods beyond the valley. Every moment spent in the shadow of that rusty overhang against the building felt like a test of fate, and I didn't wish to extend it any longer than was necessary. Then, as I softly rose into a crouch and scanned the building one last time, a chunk of stone or debris clattered from the roof overhead to the ground beyond the awning. I froze. My eyes swept to where the noise had come from, and initially I was relieved. The ground before the loading dock was empty. Then my gaze rose to the roof's edge, and I found myself face to face with something which is difficult to explain. It was a head, stone still, dark eyes wide, visible as reflective pools in the gloom. The head was flat and broad, like that of a huge snake, but it had a pale, silvery coat of fur. Its oversized mouth, lined with uneven curved teeth which reminded me of a deep-sea fish, hung open almost comically. I stared for a long moment, almost convincing myself it was fake. Then it blinked. I swung the shotgun up towards it with a speed that surprised me, adrenaline lending me a coordination that I hadn't anticipated. I fired what should have been a lethal shell, but the thing was gone, having disappeared in the blink of an eye. The thundering retort of the gun reverberated off the opposite wall across the overgrown helipad, accentuated by a dying rumble of thunder somewhere over the horizon. I froze. There was a ticking clock now, whether I grasped that fact consciously or not. Some part of me was already tallying the seconds since that deafening gunshot, measuring my options. My first instinct was to run, but the imagined expanse of the nocturnal grassland stifled that line of thought. Moreover, I'd seen no hint of movement save bent grass as it passed the prison before dusk, meaning my chances of hitting it as it gave chase in the fields were slim. It had been so lithe, so quick and subdued on the move. What chance did I have of outrunning whatever this was in the open? At this point, the derelict prison seemed a better option. Imposing and deadly as it seemed, it might make for a better cage, forcing the animal into a direct avenue of approach. If I could find a dead-end hall or broad room, I might be able to gun it down as it charged in the open. A bellow came from above, shaking the aged metal of the overhanging roof. This forced my hand, and I abandoned my pack and camera on the dock, spinning for the rusted doors not far off and trying the handle. It opened with effort, squealing on protesting hinges. I slipped inside just as I heard a soft, almost indistinguishable padding along the roof. There was a flash of movement off to the side, a vague shape falling to the ground of the courtyard with quiet grace. I slammed shut the door, seeing no more than a blur, but that had been enough to convey two things about the strange creature which had watched me from the roof. Firstly, it was pale, easy to pick out in silhouette against the storm-darkened night. Secondly, it was huge, easily the size of a large tiger, perhaps bigger. These observations were hard to reconcile, but I didn't have time to dwell on them. Another of those unearthly roars rattled the rusted metal of the door through which I'd fled, and I heard the clatter of claws against metal as the thing raked the barrier in frustration. I leaned against the door, but my added weight wasn't needed. Though it was old and moldering, the door was sturdy, and the beast beyond was left to slink off through the rain, its ragged breaths audible for a moment before it slipped silently from earshot. I caught my breath, the shadows around me in the cloistered tomb-like blackness seeming to close in. My first impulse was to flick on the flashlight hanging from my belt, but I resisted. I stood in what looked to be a storeroom, cavernous and empty, the cloud-strangled moonlight only just strong enough to light my stumbling way across the floor through tiny windows along the ceiling. Whatever was outside had a way inside, and I didn't want to give away my position until it was necessary. I tried to harness what trembling aftershocks were playing themselves out at my fingertips, driving myself up a barely visible flight of rickety metal stairs in the dark, repeating the mantra of limited time in my head. The roar sounded again, somewhere farther off, and I gripped my gun like a lifeline, my sole comfort against the fear. 4 shells left. I emerged onto a small lobby or holding room, emptied of all save a mold-eaten desk. A rusted metal door had been removed from its hinges across the way, and through it I found a manse of weaving halls lined with barred iron. The cells stunk, the refuse of cheap mattresses and tattered trash long having rotted away. But there was something more. It was difficult to pick out among the irony scent of oxidized metal, but the scent of slaughtered game was present as well. I was fishing in the night, I knew, desperately hoping I stumbled across a defensible dead end. My plan was shaky but simple. A blinding beam from the flashlight at the first sign of movement in the shadow, followed by every shell I could send the creeping thing's way. Every step in the dark by the navy light of the scattered, dingy windows bolstered my nerves, the familiar weight of my shotgun keeping me sane against the occasional wails of the unseen predator. All that changed when I emerged onto the upper balcony of a high atrium, a kind of square cage of iron interwoven with glass, which might once have been a cafeteria or prison yard. Initially grateful for the slight increase in visibility, I grew nervous that other eyes would benefit even more than my own. Hugging the walls of the balcony, I inched around to observe the room below. My timing was perfect, it seemed, for as my eyes fell on a jagged panel of broken glass near the ground level, a graceful, pale shape wove through the tiny gap. It was massive, but lean, twice the length of a man and built like a big cat. Its movements, though, were low and serpentine, capable of a flexibility which made the thing seem almost like a quadrupedal eel. It squeezed through spaces and slid noiselessly along the ground as if it were all cartilage, an eerie white silhouette on the refuse-strewn tiles below. I shook off my nervous anxiety and leveled my shotgun, preparing my shot from the safety of the ledge. The distance was greater than I would have liked, but even if the shot didn't kill the thing, I would maim it. Then I could finish it off or leave it be as I saw fit. That's what I told myself, at least, coolly counting each second spent tracking the thing's awkward, wedge-shaped head. Fortunately for me, I hesitated just long enough to spot a second flash of movement off to the right. Through a double doorway long knocked from the frame, 2 more of the creatures slunk into view. There rose up a kind of subdued clicking, almost imperceptible to my ears, as the 3 wove a path around each other. Another, even larger than the first, slipped in through a duct set into the wall with preternatural fluidity and joined in this greeting. Soon, there were more than a dozen in the atrium, clicking and hissing, their heads flicking back and forth as they scented each other. Then, a roar from the jagged mouth of the largest shook the atrium ceiling, and the whole pack loped low out of the room through some passage beneath me I couldn't see. If I were to learn my heart had ceased to beat for the full 20 seconds the pack occupied the room, only to kick back into motion when they had retreated beyond view, I would not be surprised. I was woefully short on shells. What had previously been a choice between struggle or slaughter on the marsh was now flipped on its head. With no way to defend myself effectively against so many hunters, the tiny sliver of hope which escape offered was the last ray of light visible to me. I began to move as soon as the strange hunters were out of sight, keeping silent as I could while pressing along the balcony towards the opposite exit. I assumed my pursuers were making for the loading dock doors through which I had entered, and it would only be a matter of time before they wound their way up to my position. I needed to find another way. Exiting the opposite end of the atrium, I wove through yet more winding cell halls, then stumbled upstairs into a row of offices. With the hunters occasionally loosing echoing growls and calls to one another in the distant innards of the building, I never let a trip or misstep slow me down. Speed was enough of a necessity that I occasionally chanced the use of the flashlight, flicking it on just long enough to memorize the layout of a chair-crowded hallway or a trash-strewn stairwell. All the while, my goal was upwards. With a final silent plea for desperately needed luck, I turned the last bend of what looked to be a central stairwell, almost entirely in darkness. The howls weren't far off now, and I didn't have long. There had to be rooftop access, I assured myself. Then, among all the stifled breathing and distant roars, a subdued scratching sounded up ahead in the blackness, like fingernails running across a desk. It was sudden, alien to the silence of my immediate surroundings. There followed a wet, barely audible popping, as of a mouth being opened. I leveled the shotgun and, without thinking, fired a shell into the dark. Momentarily deafened by the confined blast, I felt rather than heard the impact of a sleek, limp body slide down into me along the stairs. I pushed past it blindly, groping in the wake of the muzzle flash, boots slipping on the blood of whatever I'd hit. Then I found the door I'd sought and escaped in breathless exhaustion into the cloudy night. Worn as I was, I had no time to rest, the chorus of excited baying from the hunters inside driving me onward. I stumbled on shaking legs over to the edge of the roof, the nerves of my close encounter on the stairway not yet played out. I found a treacherous old ladder from memories of my approach that evening, the caged sort used for maintenance, and began to clamber down. Each creaking squeal of the aged metal brought me closer to the earth below, closer to the frenzied pursuit I knew must follow. Leaping free from the ladder, I sprinted, heading south towards the grassland. I had considered hiding in the woods, but there were too many, and they were on the hunt for an intruder now. Staying close would just get me sniffed out and torn to pieces. At least in the endless fields, the wind and wet might shroud me while I moved. I kept expecting the roars to breach the restrictive walls of the prison as I moved, but fortune was on my side, and I made the grass within a minute, free of direct pursuit. I didn't enjoy the solitude for long. A chorus of awful noise filled the air. Stooping low as best I could while keeping to my breakneck pace, I tried not to pay the noises any heed. Still, even through the wind whipping the grass, my ringing ears could trace the death song of the hunters growing nearer. This was their element, I imagined. I tried not to dwell on how hopeless that made my situation. Determined as I was, the run didn't last long. fording the shallow river to try and put some sort of barrier between myself and the hunters. I tripped on a mangled old scrub plant at the edge of the marsh grass. I hit the ground hard, knocking the wind from myself, the wailing pack's voices carrying overhead on the wind while I wheezed and coughed. I did what I could, dragging myself forth into the grass with straining limbs and pulling my shotgun after me. I rolled onto my back, prepared to lay absolutely still, trying to will the things away from me. I tried to focus on the clouded sky above, tracing patterns in the swirl, distracting myself from the throttling tension of my surroundings. Then a shadow fell across me, and I craned my eyes towards the riverbank. Poised like a meerkat on its hind legs, head twitching back and forth to observe the plains, one of the hunters had arrived. It had not yet left the shallows of the water, scoping out the terrain before making its next move. It hadn't noticed me, at least not yet. I readied the gun across my chest as best I could, every motion minute. If it looked down, I would be ready. The sky blazed then, loud cracks breaking through the driving wind upon the field. The reddish light that caught the hunter's wide-eyed serpentine head gave me a clear look after a long night of half-glimpses. Its maw, filled with teeth like a Venus flytrap's barbs, twitched with agitation, its head seeking out the source of the light. Then, in a flash of manic motion, it was gone, skittering across the river in a frenzy of clicks which was answered by its fellows in the grass. Another crack in the distance, followed by yet another red glare from overhead. I rose just enough to see a flare burning up its meteoric path from the far ridgeline. With a last glance toward the river to ensure my pursuers had gone, I collected myself, stood up from the mud, and fled through the grass towards the distant voices on the edge of the valley. By the time I reached them, dawn had cracked the horizon, and my horrid night in the prison seemed almost a half-remembered dream. Camped on the ridge within the woods, I found Bogdan, the fur trader I'd seen the previous morning in town. He and his sons had been preparing for a pre-dawn hunt when they'd heard my shotgun from across the valley. My earlier read on him had been misplaced, it seemed, for he clapped me on my shaking shoulders and offered to guide me back into town. Armed with AK-47s rather than hunting rifles, they didn't seem to need an explanation for why my supplies were gone, or why I looked so ragged. They simply stared off over the marsh through the misty dawn after those departing roars, and laughed.